A quiet village, a widow's whisper, and a secret that refuses to stay buried. Welcome to Tea and Clue. I am your host, Harrington. Tell me, where in the world are you listening from tonight? Your comments light up this journey. Let's begin. The morning had begun with the kind of serenity only St. Mary Mead could produce, a calm so thorough it made even the clock tower seem hesitant to strike the hour. A faint mist clung to the hedgerows as the village prepared for the Vicarage Garden Fair, that annual occasion when everyone, ladies from the Women's Institute, the retired colonel, and the butcher's wife alike, turned out to admire dahlias, exchange gossip, and pretend they hadn't been talking about each other all week. Miss Marple, in a pale blue hat that looked as though it might have belonged to another decade, arrived promptly at 10, carrying a basket of her famous sponge cakes. Her smile was mild, her eyes observant and her mind quietly alert. She noted at once that Mrs. Ledger, the vicar's widow, was already there, standing beside the white marquee, her gloved hands trembling ever so slightly as she arranged a tray of cucumber sandwiches. It had been less than a year since the vicar's sudden passing, a stroke, so everyone said, and Mrs. Ledger's transformation from brisk, capable wife to fragile hostess had earned her both sympathy and suspicion. Miss Marple, who did not often believe in transformations, simply watched. "Poor dear, she's quite changed," murmured Mrs. Price Ridley, leaning in toward Miss Marple as they inspected the preserves table. "It must be the loneliness. I heard she's letting the old study to that writer fellow from London. What sort of man rents rooms in a vicarage, I ask you?" "Perhaps one in need of peace and quiet," Miss Marple replied gently, but her gaze lingered on Mrs. Ledger's face, pale beneath her summer hat, as the widow glanced toward the churchyard. Something in that look was not loneliness, it was apprehension. The fair began in earnest by mid-morning. Children ran about with lemonade bottles. Colonel Melchett presided over the tombola, and the village choir, somewhat flat, rendered Abide With Me with misplaced enthusiasm. It was all as it should be, except for the tension threading through the air like an unseen wire. Shortly before noon, a commotion began near the tea tent. A plate of sandwiches had been overturned, and Mrs. Ledger stood frozen beside it, her gloved hand pressed to her mouth. The London writer, Mr. Giles Corbett, was crouched beside a crumpled figure on the grass. "Good heavens," gasped Miss Hartnell. "It's Mr. Pierce, the solicitor." Indeed it was. Henry Pierce, the mild, fussy man who managed half the wills and property deeds in the parish, lay motionless beneath the bunting. The cup of tea in his hand had spilled across his waistcoat, staining it dark. A faint odour, a mixture of almonds and something acrid, hung in the air. For a long moment no one moved. Then Mrs. Ledger gave a low, strangled cry and collapsed against the table. "Fetch Dr. Haydock," shouted Colonel Melchett, pushing through the gathering crowd. "And someone send for Inspector Craven." Miss Marple did not shout. She merely bent down, studying the overturned plate, the cup, and the faint glint of something metallic beneath the grass. A teaspoon, its edge tinged with an odd discoloration. Her expression did not change, but her thoughts moved swiftly. Moments later, as the first wail of the ambulance sounded from the village road, she turned to the vicar's widow, now pale and trembling under Mrs. Price Ridley's anxious ministrations. "My dear," Miss Marple said softly, "perhaps you should sit down. These things are most distressing, though—" Her voice trailed just slightly. "I suppose poor Mr. Pierce must have had reason enough to visit your table in particular, hadn't he?" Mrs. Ledger's eyes widened, then flickered away. I don't know what you mean, Miss Marple," she whispered. Miss Marple only smiled. "No, of course not, my dear. But I dare say we shall all know soon enough." The fair continued in fragments after that. Children hushed, music silenced, villagers whispering behind parasols. Word spread like ivy. "Mr. Pierce dead at the fair. Poison? They say he'd been arguing with the widow last week. Something about the vicar's estate. And through it all, Miss Marple sat quietly beneath the shade of an elm, her tea untouched, watching the patterns of behavior unfold around her. Guilt, shock, self-preservation, curiosity. Every expression told a story, and she, more than anyone, knew how stories in villages often ended. She noticed that Mr. Corbett, the tenant, seemed oddly composed for a man who had just found a body. He stood slightly apart, lighting a cigarette, his gaze following the stretcher as it was carried away. Mrs. Ledger had turned her face to the ground, trembling still, while Colonel Melchett barked orders and the police began cordoning off the tea tent. A faint breeze carried the scent of roses and something bitter. Miss Marple looked toward the churchyard again, where the vicar's grave stood beneath its modest stone. Her eyes softened with thought. Murder had come again to St. Mary Mead, and as always, it was not the violence itself that interested her, but the curious human tangle behind it. She rose, smoothed her gloves, and murmured to no one in particular, "I do wonder what the late vicar would think of it all." End of Section 1, The Hook. Would you like me to continue with Section 2, The Village Reacts, approximate 900 words, where gossip spreads, the police arrive, and Miss Marple begins quietly piecing together the first threads of the mystery? The ambulance had scarcely turned onto the high road when the hush of propriety loosened into the rustle of speculation. By the tea tent, Miss Hartnell told Mrs. Price Ridley she had smelled almonds, and that Mr. Pierce had a weak heart. Inspector Craven arrived from Much Benham with 2 constables, and the air of a man who meant to be practical. One officer stood at the marquee entrance, another by the Lichgate path. Dr. Haydock, sleeves pushed back, knelt where the grass showed the weight of a body, rose with a grim line to his mouth, and nodded once. "Best to assume poison," he said. "We shall confirm it." Statements began, and the village produced them with gratifying speed. The choir girls described pouring tea at the south end. Cups moved along the trestle where sandwiches were added by Mrs. Price Ridley, and, when busy by the vicar's widow, Mrs. Ledger, pale but composed, admitted that Mr. Pierce had spoken to her on Thursday about parish papers, and that she had directed him to the vestry cupboard. "What papers precisely?" asked Craven. "The bequest for repairs to the west wall," she said, folding and unfolding her gloves. "My late husband kept such things in order." Yet her eyes slid past the inspector to the churchyard, as though stones might prompt her. Giles Corbett, the quiet lodger in the vicarage study, spoke briefly. He had been paying for a jam tart when Mr. Pierce stumbled, had bent at once and had called for the doctor. He did not embroider. Miss Marple thought thrift in speech often accompanies thrift in feeling. Miss Marple sat where she could observe without being in the way. Her knitting remained in her bag. She watched a constable slip a discoloured teaspoon into a paper envelope, and noticed that the blue willow bowl, holding the remaining spoons, bore a hairline crack along its rim, stained a shade darker than the glaze, as if something wet had lingered there and been briskly wiped away. Small domestic wrongnesses, she knew, often precede larger ones. Craven traced the journey of one cup with care, poured by Sally Pratt, set upon the trestle, touched by Mrs. Ledger for a sandwich, halted beside Colonel Melchett, and taken by Mr. Pierce, who, according to 3 witnesses, remarked that the cucumber was thin in the proper fashion. Order, Miss Marple reflected, becomes dangerous when it is agreeable. Dr. Haydock, requesting water, paused beside her. "You think it was deliberate?" he asked. "I think Mr. Pierce did not care for surprises," she said. "He balanced ledgers and curtains alike. Such men do not choose to die at fairs. If he died in public, someone else chose the hour." Haydock's mouth twitched. "You see more than is strictly provided." "One tries," said Miss Marple, and one of the helpers handled a spoon as though it were a pen. "The gestures are not the same." Craven asked Mrs. Ledger to attend at the station later. She agreed. When he turned away, she steadied herself on the tablecloth and left, without knowing it, a faint smear with the dull sheen of cheap face powder. Miss Marple, passing, touched it with a gloved fingertip, then coughed in that gentle way old ladies have when they wish the young to be clever. The eager constable collected the square of linen. "Thank you, my dear," Miss Marple said pleasantly. "Things have a habit of vanishing once people remember they exist." By 2 o'clock, the bunting drooped and the teapot stood in a line, like soldiers waiting for an order that would not come. The fare dissolved into doorways. Gossip redistributed itself behind net curtains. Miss Marple walked with Dr. Haydock to the lich gate. At the gate she paused and looked toward the vicarage windows. "A house tells one when it is content," she said. "Chairs sit square. Books look at you. But that study has been unsettled. Things opened and put back not quite where they were." "You have not been in it," Haydock observed. "No," said Miss Marple, but Mrs. Ledger pulls at her gloves, as if cupboard doors had resisted her. A woman who keeps rooms as her husband left them does not develop that habit without a struggle. It is only an impression. Impressions must not be mistaken for proofs. Craven rejoined them, notebook closed. "If you recall anything unusual, anyone lingering by the tea, do tell me," he said. "I shall," she replied. "And if you discover that Mr. Pierce's visit on Thursday concerned more than a wall, please tell me in return. Parish cupboards are sometimes hospitable to other people's secrets." He nodded and took his leave. Miss Marple remained by the gate a moment, listening to bees and to subtler sound beneath them, the shifting of loyalties that follows calamity. Somewhere a door closed. Somewhere else a telephone rang and was promptly answered. She turned toward the village, thinking of a stained crack on a blue bowl, a paper twist under rhubarb, and a touch of powder on linen. None of these amounted to evidence, but village crimes are seldom solved by evidence. They yield to the stubborn habits of the heart. She thought too of Mr. Pierce, who disliked fuss, and of the vicarage widow who looked toward the churchyard when she spoke of cupboards. Human nature, tidy as it longs to be, always leaves one drawer ajar. That evening St. Mary Mead was abuzz with conjecture. Curtains twitched earlier than usual, and supper conversations turned solemn. The village that had begun the day with sponge cake and raffle tickets now ended it with whispers of cyanide and scandal. Word had spread that Mr. Pierce's death was not natural, and though the police refused to say more, such restraint only encouraged invention. Miss Marple, seated comfortably in her parlour with a small lamp beside her chair, listened to the faint murmur of the village carried through the open window. She knew well the rhythm of gossip, the way it stretched, tangled, and eventually found its way to truth. But she also knew that behind the noise there were quieter voices worth attending to, the silences between words, the hesitations in eyes. Earlier that afternoon, Inspector Craven had called briefly at her cottage. He had been polite, deferential even, but clearly skeptical of her gentle advice. "We'll be sending the cup and spoon to the laboratory in London," he had told her, notebook in hand. "Dr. Haydock suspects cyanide, as you said. I don't suppose you noticed anything else." "Unusual?" Miss Marple had smiled, folding her hands neatly. "Only that Mrs. Ledger did not faint properly. It was quite theatrical, but her knees never gave way. And people who have lost control do not tidy their gloves immediately after, Inspector. They tremble or they forget." Mrs. Ledger remembered. He had thanked her and gone, leaving behind a faint impression of amusement. That was all right. Men like Inspector Craven always found her mildly quaint, until she stopped being quaint. Now, as dusk deepened over the thatched roofs, Miss Marple poured herself a small cup of tea and thought about the dead man. Henry Pierce had been meticulous, punctual, and unadventurous, an unlikely subject for poison. Unless, of course, he had stumbled into something inconvenient. Her reverie was interrupted by a soft knock. When she opened the door, she found Giles Corbett standing there, the London writer whose name had begun to appear on everyone's lips since the fair. His expression was pleasant but tight, as though stretched over something uneasy. "Forgive me for calling so late, Miss Marple," he said. "I thought perhaps you might have heard about Mrs. Ledger. The police have been questioning her again." "Indeed?" she said mildly, motioning him inside. "Do come in, Mr. Corbett. I dare say this has all been rather distressing for you, living so near the centre of it." He sat stiffly, glancing at her orderly room. "They've taken away half the contents of the vicar's study. Boxes, ledgers, some of them quite old." Mrs. Ledger was in tears. "She says they think her husband hid something. Some legal papers connected with Mr. Pierce." Miss Marple stirred her tea, letting the silence draw him onward. "It's all nonsense, of course," he continued. "Pierce was helping her sort her affairs. She's been terribly fragile since the vicar's death." "I'm sure she has," said Miss Marple gently. "Though I wonder, was she fragile before the fair? You've lived under her roof, you'd know her moods better than most." Corbett hesitated, then forced a small laugh. "She's been anxious lately. She spends hours in that study at night, going through her husband's papers. I think it comforts her. Memories, you see." "Memories can be difficult companions," Miss Marple said softly. "Did she ever speak of Mr. Pierce in particular?" "Only that he'd been pressuring her to sign some document, something about a trust the vicar established for the church. She seemed bothered but not frightened. You know how lawyers are." "Indeed I do," said Miss Marple. "They seldom press without reason. Tell me, Mr. Corbett, did you happen to notice who poured Mr. Pierce's tea at the fair?" He blinked, taken aback. No, I don't think I did. There were so many people bustling about. Mrs. Ledger handed him his plate, that much I saw. But the tea? I couldn't say," she smiled, serene and unreadable. "Yes, sometimes it is the things we cannot say that matter most." He rose a few minutes later, making polite excuses. Miss Marple walked him to the door, her expression thoughtful. When he'd gone, she stood looking into the twilight for a long while. The next morning she took a leisurely walk to the post office. Along the way, she encountered Mrs. Price Ridley, who of course had updates to share. "They found something dreadful," she whispered, eyes alight. "A letter Mr. Pierce wrote to the vicar, years ago before his death. They say it mentions a sum of money unaccounted for." "Imagine, in the vicarage of all places," Miss Marple listened politely. "Money can be troublesome, Mrs. Price Ridley. It brings out the very worst qualities in otherwise estimable people." At the corner she met Dr. Haydock, who tipped his hat. "The laboratory reports back," he said quietly. "Cyanide, as expected. Enough to fell a horse. Poor Pierce never had a chance. Do you know how it was administered?" "In his tea, almost certainly. There were faint traces on the spoon." Miss Marple nodded. "And the teaspoon came from Mrs. Ledger's table, did it not?" Haydock frowned. "Yes, but half the village used that table. We've no direct link." "Unless you found one?" "Oh, nothing certain," she said lightly. "Only that Mrs. Ledger once told me she couldn't abide the smell of bitter almonds. It gives her headaches." "Curious that she didn't notice it at the fair, don't you think?" That evening, Miss Marple watched the lamplight flicker through her window and considered her growing collection of observations. Mrs. Ledger's feigned fainting, her quiet anxiety over the study, the mysterious letter connecting Mr. Pierce to the late vicar's finances, all of it formed a pattern that, while incomplete, was beginning to coalesce. There was something else, too, Giles Corbett's nervousness. It wasn't grief. It was apprehension. He'd spoken of Mrs. Ledger's nocturnal habits with too much precision, as if rehearsed, and when she'd mentioned the pouring of the tea, he had not looked puzzled. He had looked wary. By the time the church bell tolled 8, Miss Marple had resolved to take a little walk the following morning, to the vicarage, ostensibly to pay her respects to the grieving widow. In truth, she intended to examine something else entirely, the study, the heart of the matter, and perhaps the secret that had followed Mr. Pierce to his grave. For in St. Mary Mead, she reflected, death rarely arrives by accident, and where poison is concerned, there is always someone close enough to stir the cup. The following morning dawned pale and heavy with mist, as though the village itself were reluctant to see clearly what had been set in motion. Miss Marple, wrapped in her soft grey shawl, made her way toward the vicarage with deliberate calm. She carried a small basket of muffins, a token of sympathy that excused even the most inquisitive visitor. The iron gate creaked faintly as she opened it, and the path, still damp with dew, led her through a garden that had once been well kept, but now showed signs of neglect. The roses leaned untended over their borders, and weeds pushed through the gravel. Mrs. Ledger met her at the door, her eyes rimmed red but her hair perfectly arranged. "Oh, Miss Marple, how kind of you," she said softly, taking the basket with trembling hands. "It's all been so dreadful. The police were here again before breakfast. I can hardly think straight." "My dear, anyone would be unsettled," Miss Marple replied, her tone one of soothing sympathy. "Such a terrible thing to happen at so cheerful an occasion. And poor Mr. Pierce, he seemed such a precise sort of man." Mrs. Ledger pressed her lips together. "He was too precise, some would say. He took it upon himself to question my late husband's decisions about parish funds, as if a vicar would misplace church money. It was humiliating." "Humiliating, yes," Miss Marple agreed quietly. "I imagine that must have weighed heavily on you." The widow hesitated, then gave a quick shake of her head. "It's all nonsense, of course, but the police think there was something improper. They took Ledger's and even Richard's sermons. Such indignity." Miss Marple nodded, following as Mrs. Ledger led her into the sitting room. The curtains were half drawn, the air faintly scented with lavender polish. From her armchair near the hearth, Miss Marple could see the study door across the hall, closed, but not quite latched. She made gentle conversation about the fair, the weather, and the strain of solitude. Mrs. Ledger responded automatically, her voice thin, her eyes darting toward the study more than once. Finally she rose to pour tea, offering, "You'll forgive the state of things. I haven't been myself." Miss Marple smiled kindly. "You do very well, my dear. I always say order in one's home reflects order in the heart, though sometimes a locked drawer can disturb both." The teapot clinked sharply against the tray. Mrs. Ledger turned, startled, spilling a few drops onto her cuff. I beg your pardon?" "Oh, nothing, my dear," said Miss Marple lightly, reaching to dab the spill with her handkerchief. "Merely an old lady's reflection. We all keep things locked away now and again, don't we? Memories, papers, sometimes regrets." For an instant, something flickered in Mrs. Ledger's expression. Fear or defiance, it was hard to tell. Then she composed herself, offering a weak smile. "You're very perceptive, Miss Marple. I suppose we all have our burdens." After tea, Miss Marple made her way politely to the door, but paused at the threshold. "Oh, you mustn't tire yourself, my dear. I'll call again soon, perhaps tomorrow afternoon." Mrs. Ledger nodded absently, her eyes already returning to the study door. Outside, Miss Marple paused by the hedge. She could see faint impressions in the soil beneath the study window, a set of footprints, narrow and deep, perhaps made by a man's shoes rather than the widow's. They led from the garden path to the window and back again, though one set appeared fresher than the other. She bent slightly, examining the marks with practiced interest, before continuing homeward. By mid-morning the village was once more humming with conjecture. Miss Hartnell stopped her outside the post office to declare that the widow was a strange one, while Mrs. Price Ridley insisted that no respectable woman would take in a male lodger so soon after bereavement. Each theory grew more elaborate with every repetition. Miss Marple listened with polite patience, but stored away what truly mattered, that gossip had its own rhythm, and those who tried too hard to guide it often had something to conceal. That afternoon, Inspector Craven arrived at Miss Marple's cottage, looking unusually grave. "We've uncovered something odd in the late vicar's accounts," he said, taking the chair she offered. "There's a withdrawal of £200 made 3 weeks before his death, no record of where it went, and Mrs. Ledger claims she never knew of it." Miss Marple poured him tea, her expression mild. And Mr. Pierce was investigating that matter, I assume? He was, yes. He wrote to the diocesan treasurer about it. Seems he'd arranged to meet Mrs. Ledger yesterday to finalize his report, which makes his death rather conveniently timed. Convenience, said Miss Marple, is a curious word, Inspector. It often points less to opportunity than to fear. Who, I wonder, was most afraid of that report? Craven sighed. We'll find out. Though between ourselves, that writer fellow doesn't sit right with me. Corbett. Claims he was in London the morning Pierce called, but we can't verify it. Says he writes thrillers. What sort of man does that from a vicar's study? Man who values quiet, perhaps, Miss Marple suggested, though she noted the inspector's unease. Still, I've found that writers, like vicars, tend to keep notebooks. Have you asked to see his? Craven smiled thinly. You've a sharper mind than most of my sergeants, Miss Marple. She inclined her head modestly. Age brings observation, Inspector. Not sharpness, merely habit. After he'd left, Miss Marple sat for a long while by her window watching the village street. Giles Corbett passed by not long after, striding briskly toward the church. His coat pockets bulged slightly, and he looked neither right nor left. A man with something to hide, Miss Marple thought, seldom hides it well. They are too preoccupied by the act itself. That evening, she took a small walk to clear her thoughts, and as she passed near the vicarage gate, she saw the faint gleam of a candle through the study window. It was nearly 9, too late for a grieving widow to be working over ledgers. She paused just long enough to see a shadow move across the curtain. The figure was not Mrs. Ledger's slight shape. It was taller, angular, and deliberate in motion. Miss Marple withdrew quietly into the darkness, her heart steady, her mind beginning to form the first fragile outline of truth. Secrets, she knew, had begun to stir in the vicarage again. And when secrets began to move, murder was seldom finished with its work. The next morning the mist had burned away, leaving St. Mary Mead too bright for comfort. The village looked almost cheerful again, though beneath the surface the quiet hum of scandal continued. Miss Marple walked toward the high street with her basket, and a purposeful calm that disguised how much she had learned from last night's shadow at the vicarage window. She meant to call at the post office first. There were always fragments of truth hiding among letters and stamps, and afterward to stop by the church, where she suspected a conversation with the verger might yield something overlooked. Inside the post office, Mrs. Crump was sorting envelopes with the self-importance of one who knew every secret before it reached its destination. "Good morning, Miss Marple," she said. "Terrible business about poor Mr. Pierce. Did you hear they've found ink stains on one of his fingers? Cyanide leaves a trace, so they say." "How interesting," Miss Marple murmured, buying 2 stamps she did not need. "And were there any letters of his still unposted?" Mrs. Crump lowered her voice. "There was one for the diocesan treasurer. Inspector Craven came for it himself. Recorded delivery, he said. Odd thing, it was sealed but had no return address. Lawyers don't do that, do they?" "No," Miss Marple said, her eyes kind but thoughtful. "They prefer to be found when necessary." When she left, she saw Giles Corbett crossing the green toward the vicarage. He carried a satchel heavier than before, and walked with the quick, guilty energy of a man late for something unpleasant. Miss Marple followed at a distance, her steps unhurried. By the time she reached the gate, Corbett had disappeared inside. Through an upper window she could hear faint voices, his and Mrs. Ledger's, sharp at first, then muffled. She waited long enough to note the rhythm of their tones, argument, then persuasion, then a pause that ended with the sound of a drawer closing. When she returned home, she found Inspector Craven waiting on her path, hat in hand. "You were right about the spoon," he said without preamble. "Traces of cyanide on the underside of the handle, not just in the bowl. Whoever prepared the tea must have handled it carelessly." Miss Marple smiled faintly. or quite carefully if the goal was to disguise who poured it. You've spoken to Mrs. Ledger again, I expect? He nodded. She claims Pierce served himself. But there's something else. Corbett's story doesn't hold. He said he was in London the morning of the fair, but we found the innkeeper at Much Benham remembers seeing him take breakfast at 7. The train to London doesn't leave until 8:30. Ah, Miss Marple said softly. Men who invent alibis tend to forget timetables. The village clock is a cruel companion to a liar. Craven gave a short laugh. We'll bring him in for questioning. Still, I can't see the motive. Perhaps not yet, she said, but the widow is afraid of something more than the police, and fear is usually a mirror. Look in the reflection, and you'll see who truly holds the secret. That afternoon she visited the churchyard under the pretext of tending the vicar's grave. The grass around the stone had been freshly disturbed, and a small scrap of paper, half buried in soil, caught her eye. She lifted it delicately with her trowel. It was the corner of an old receipt, Pierce's handwriting, she thought, with the word trust still visible and the faded date from 2 years past. She slipped it into her glove, smoothing the earth, again before any eyes from the cottages across the lane could notice. As she left the churchyard, she met young Inspector Craven coming down the path. Corbett's at the station, he said. Swears he knows nothing, says he was editing a manuscript in the study at the time Pierce died. Editing, Miss Marple repeated. A task requiring quiet, and perhaps the removal of certain inconvenient papers. Her tone was mild, but her eyes were bright. Did you search his satchel? Not yet. We've sent for a warrant. Then may I suggest you look also at the wastepaper basket in the vicar's study? Writers, I find, dispose of truth by tearing it into smaller pieces. He thanked her again, half smiling, and went on his way. Miss Marple watched him until he vanished beyond the yews, then turned toward home, the soft soil still clinging to her shoes. That evening, while knitting beside her lamp, she arranged the facts in the tidy order she preferred. Pierce's discovery about the missing trust money, the vicar's mysterious withdrawal, Mrs. Ledger's fear, Corbett's false alibi, and the shadow moving in the study at night. There was, she thought, a chain connecting them, and like most human chains it was bound by vanity rather than greed. A man like Corbett would not kill for money, but for pride perhaps, or for the preservation of a reputation. Writers, after all, invented stories for a living. They disliked being characters in one. At 9:30, a knock sounded at her door. It was Dr. Haydock, his face set in lines of fatigue. There's been another shock, he said. Mrs. Ledger's collapsed again. This time genuine, I think. We found her unconscious in the study. Window open, the room in disarray. She's alive, but only just. Miss Marple rose at once, steady and calm. And Mr. Corbett? Gone, left his things behind. The constable on duty swears he didn't see him leave. She fetched her coat. Then it seems, Doctor, that our murderer has not yet finished what he began. Together, they crossed the lane toward the vicarage, the night heavy and still. A single lamp burned behind the study curtain, and the scent of bitter almonds drifted faintly on the air. Miss Marple paused at the threshold, her eyes narrowing. How curious, she murmured. Murderers rarely return to the scene unless something they left behind is more dangerous than guilt. And with that quiet observation, she stepped inside, already seeing the shape of the truth taking form in the shadows of the vicar's old study. The smell of bitter almonds still hung faintly in the air as Miss Marple entered the vicarage study, her eyes moving slowly over the disordered room. Papers lay scattered across the desk. A lamp had been overturned, and the curtains stirred slightly in the night air that came through the open window. Dr. Haydock knelt beside Mrs. Ledger, who lay on the carpet, her face deathly pale, her breathing shallow but steady. The doctor's bag stood open beside him, a hypodermic glinting under the lamplight. She'll live, he said after a moment, wiping his hands. It's a faint from shock, not poison this time. But she's been frightened badly. Something happened here, Miss Marple." Miss Marple bent closer, her sharp blue eyes scanning the scene. "Yes," she said softly, "and I believe we've just missed the man responsible. Tell me, Doctor, where is Inspector Craven?" "Still at the station. I sent a constable ahead to fetch him." "Good. Then before he arrives, let us look carefully. People tidy crime scenes unintentionally when they panic, and the truth gets swept away with the broken glass." She moved lightly about the room, touching nothing yet seeing everything. The papers scattered on the floor were not random. Most were sermons, yellowed at the edges, but a few newer sheets were typed. She noticed that one, the topmost page, bore the initials GC neatly typed at the bottom. She lifted it delicately with a knitting needle from her bag and read a line aloud. It was greed that made him dangerous, but conscience that killed him. "Curious sentiment," she murmured. "It sounds like the confession of an author, or the preface of one." Dr. Haydock frowned. "Corbett's work, I suppose." He had a flair for the dramatic. "Indeed, though I suspect his flair extends beyond the written page." Her gaze shifted to the open window. "These marks on the sill, scratches, you see. Fresh ones, and footprints again in the flower bed below. He came through here tonight. I would wager he intended to retrieve something he had hidden earlier." "Hidden? In the study?" Miss Marple nodded. "Writers are vain, Doctor. They prefer to place their secrets in reach of their own hand. A desk drawer, perhaps, or a hollow book. Yes, there, the second shelf." Dr. Haydock followed her line of sight. A thick, dusty Bible lay slightly out of alignment with the rest. He lifted it, and from between the pages fell a folded document, bound with an aging red ribbon. Miss Marple bent to read the heading, "Parish Trust Account, Supplemental Agreement, 1934. "So," she said softly, "the missing paper. The one Pierce was investigating." Haydock exhaled. "Then Corbett found it first." "Precisely. He must have discovered it when Mrs. Ledger left him to sort through the vicar's effects. He likely meant to use it, perhaps to blackmail her or to sell the story. But Mr. Pierce realized the paper existed and came too close. That would never do for a man who trades in reputation." They were interrupted by the sound of hurried footsteps in the hall. Inspector Craven entered, his coat damp from the fog. "You found her alive, then?" he asked breathlessly. "Good Lord, what happened?" Miss Marple explained briefly, handing him the folded document. He read the first few lines, his brow darkening. "It's evidence of embezzlement. The late vicar transferred church funds into a private account, likely intending to repay them, but never did. Mrs. Ledger must have known." "And Corbett found it?" "I believe so," Miss Marple said. "And when Mr. Pierce uncovered the same truth, Corbett saw ruin for both himself and his landlady. He couldn't risk Pierce exposing it. He'd lose his lodgings, perhaps even his career. So he chose a simpler solution, a spoon and a drop of poison. But tonight, what was he after?" "The paper, Inspector. He hid it here, intending to retrieve it once suspicion turned elsewhere. But Mrs. Ledger must have discovered him. He frightened her, then fled through the window. I dare say he's making for the station now." Craven swore softly and signaled to his sergeant. "Get 2 men to the main road. He won't get far." The constable rushed out, boots thudding on the tiles. Miss Marple watched them go, her expression one of mild regret. "He'll be clever enough to take a different route, I think. Men in fear seldom run straight. There's an old footpath through the orchard behind the vicarage. It leads to the mill road. If you wish to catch him, Inspector, that's where he'll pass." Craven hesitated only a moment, then hurried after his men. The house fell quiet again. Dr. Haydock lifted Mrs. Ledger to the sofa, covering her with a blanket. Her eyelids fluttered, and she murmured faintly, He said I must forget. Said it was only fiction." "Hush now," Miss Marple said gently. "Fiction often borrows from life, my dear, though life never thanks it for doing so." An hour later, the sound of returning footsteps broke the stillness. Craven entered, his face grim but satisfied. "We have him," he said simply. "Tried to catch the night lorry at the Mill Road. Had the vicar's checkbook and a small bottle in his coat pocket. He'll hang, I expect." Miss Marple lowered her eyes. "A tragic ending, Inspector, though not undeserved. Yet I doubt Mrs. Ledger will find comfort in it. She's been punished already, living with guilt that was never wholly her own." Craven looked toward the unconscious woman on the sofa. "You think she knew about her husband's theft?" "She knew enough to fear exposure, but not enough to act. She is one of those women who confuse loyalty with silence." Outside, dawn was beginning to pale the sky. Miss Marple drew the curtains aside and looked toward the churchyard where the vicar's grave stood in still shadow. "It seems," she said quietly, "that the sins of the husband and the vanity of a writer have together cost 2 lives. Mr. Pierce, who sought truth, and now perhaps Mrs. Ledger, whose heart is broken by it." Dr. Haydock closed his bag and sighed. "And you, Miss Marple, what will you do now?" "Me? I shall go home and finish my knitting," she said serenely. "There's comfort in plain work after the untidy business of murder. Besides, I fancy the village will be most eager to discuss it by breakfast, and one must listen. There's always something to be learned from what people think they know." She left quietly, the first light of morning touching her hat as she stepped into the lane. The mystery nearly solved, but her mind still turning, because in St. Mary Mead, truth, like gossip, was never quite finished. By the time Miss Marple reached her cottage, the first birds were stirring in the hedgerows, and a faint pearliness colored the eastern sky. She hung up her shawl, lit her small lamp, and sat down at her writing desk, though she did not write. Instead, she thought, slowly, methodically, with that delicate precision that had so often led her to conclusions the police overlooked. Something in the inspector's satisfaction unsettled her. Corbett's arrest seemed too simple, too neat. Real evil, Miss Marple knew, rarely tidied itself into such convenient packages. She poured herself a cup of tea and took a slow sip. The bitterness of it, faint but distinct, made her pause. She smiled to herself, faintly amused. "I must be jumpy," she murmured, setting the cup aside. But her eyes had narrowed slightly. Even imagination, she reminded herself, was a form of evidence. At 8 o'clock, the village began to wake. Mrs. Price Ridley was already outside, sweeping her step, and the postman, cheerful despite the hour, greeted Miss Marple as she emerged for her morning walk. She walked toward the high street not out of habit, but because she wished to pass the police station and, if fortune favored her, encounter Inspector Craven. She did not have to wait long. Craven came out himself, coatless and weary but clearly pleased with the night's results. "Ah, Miss Marple," he said, smiling in a way that was almost boyish. "All finished now. Corbett's confessed. Quite the talker once he started. Said he never meant to kill Pierce, only to frighten him. Claims the poison was intended as a bluff, some nonsense about demonstrating realism for a novel." Miss Marple's expression did not change. "And you believe him?" Craven shrugged. "He's admitted everything. The theft, the forgery, even the hiding of that trust document. The jury will hang him, confession or not. A good night's work, I should say." "Indeed," she said softly, "though I often find confessions given at dawn tend to wilt in daylight." The inspector laughed, but uneasily. "You think there's more to it?" "I think, Inspector, that the truth has layers, much like a sponge cake. Remove the top, and you may find another beneath it. Tell me, did Mr. Corbett volunteer this confession, or was it prompted?" Craven frowned. He was tired, frightened, said he'd rather hang than spend another night in the cell. "Haydock's given him a sedative. He's asleep now." "Then we shall not disturb him," Miss Marple said. "But perhaps we might reconsider Mrs. Ledger." "What of her?" "She's still weak. Haydock says she'll recover." "Did you question her before she collapsed?" "Only briefly. She denied all knowledge of the missing money and said her husband handled all parish affairs." "Typical widow's talk. Why?" Miss Marple's eyes softened. "Because I think she told you the truth, but not the whole of it. I suspect she knew what her husband had done, but believed his death had sealed the secret. Mr. Pierce's investigation frightened her, yes, but not enough to kill him. Fear often drives people to silence, Inspector, not to action. Craven looked thoughtful but unconvinced. If not her, then who? Corbett's the only one who had access. Access, yes, Miss Marple said, but not necessarily opportunity. She smiled gently. Murder, Inspector, is very like embroidery. One must look at the back of the pattern to see the knots, and the neatest stitch may hide the cruelest tangle. She thanked him for his time and went on her way. Her steps, though measured, carried her not home but toward the vicarage once again. The garden was quiet, dew still clinging to the grass. Through the open kitchen window came the faint sound of movement, someone tidying dishes. Miss Marple knocked softly and entered to find Nurse Bellamy, a sturdy woman with capable hands, preparing a tray. "Good morning, Nurse," Miss Marple said pleasantly. "I hope our dear Mrs. Ledger is more comfortable." "Resting, miss. Doctor said she's to have only weak tea and no visitors." "How sensible," Miss Marple replied. "Still, perhaps I might just peek in, only to see that she sleeps well." The nurse hesitated, then relented. "Only a minute, mind you." In the dim light of the study, Mrs. Ledger lay on the sofa, her breathing shallow but steady. Her hands were folded loosely across her chest, but Miss Marple noticed something odd. A faint smudge on the inside of one wrist, dark and irregular. Ink, perhaps, or dust. Miss Marple leaned closer, careful not to disturb her. The stain had the faint blue-grey hue of silver nitrate, a chemical once used for photographic developing. When she returned to the kitchen, she asked casually, "Does Mrs. Ledger take photographs?" The nurse blinked. "Oh, yes, miss, she used to. There's a dark room upstairs, the vicar's old hobby. She said she'd not used it since he died." Miss Marple smiled, though her eyes grew distant. "I wonder, nurse, would you be so good as to fetch me a glass of water? I feel a trifle faint." While the nurse bustled off, Miss Marple moved silently up the back staircase. The door to the small attic darkroom was ajar. Inside, the air smelled of old chemicals, developer, fixer, something acrid beneath. Dust motes swam in the single shaft of light that pierced the curtains. On a small table sat several glass bottles, one labeled potassium cyanide in faded ink. Another bore the initials HL, Henry Ledger. Miss Marple touched nothing. She stood still, listening to the faint hum of the house, then descended quietly before the nurse returned. When she stepped back into the morning sunlight, her mind was made up. She walked straight to the police station. "Inspector," she said calmly when Craven appeared, "you must release Mr. Corbett at once. He may be a liar, but he is not a murderer." Craven blinked. "Not a murderer? But the confession given to protect someone, I think," Miss Marple interrupted gently. "Someone he pitied or loved or feared." "The poison did not come from the kitchen, Inspector. It came from the vicar's darkroom, a place Mr. Corbett would hardly have known existed. The cyanide was the vicar's own, kept for developing photographs. I rather think Mrs. Ledger used it once before, and again more recently. The first time, perhaps not to kill, but to hasten a heart that had already weakened. The second, to silence a man who knew too much." Craven stared at her. "You mean Mrs. Ledger poisoned her husband as well?" Miss Marple's voice was soft, almost sorrowful. "The late vicar's stroke was never examined, was it? He died in his chair alone with his tea. How convenient for a woman who had grown weary of secrets and of obedience." The inspector stood motionless for a long moment. Then slowly he turned toward the door. "I'll send for Haydock," he said quietly. "If you're right, Miss Marple, we've been looking at the wrong confession entirely." Miss Marple nodded once, the faintest sigh escaping her lips. "In St. Mary Mead, Inspector. Guilt is seldom where decency points. One must look instead where love has soured." As the church bells began to toll the half-hour, she watched him go, the morning sun glinting off his buttons. The truth, she knew, was still unfolding, and like the slow bloom of poison, it had not yet reached its end. Inspector Craven returned to the vicarage before noon, his expression grim and composed. Miss Marple followed at a discreet distance, declining his offer to wait outside. She had lived too long in St. Mary Mead to be satisfied with partial truths. When they entered the quiet house, Nurse Bellamy stood at the doorway, her face pale. "She's awake, sir," she said, "but she's different. Calm, almost too calm." Miss Marple's eyes met Craven's briefly, then she nodded for him to go ahead. The inspector stepped into the study first, his boots muffled against the rug. Mrs. Ledger sat upright on the sofa, her back to the window, hands folded neatly in her lap. The pallor of illness had given way to a strange serenity. When she looked up, her eyes met Craven's without fear. "So," she said softly, "you've come for the rest of it." "We've come for the truth, madam," Craven replied. "You've been through a great ordeal, but I think you'll agree that falsehoods won't protect anyone now." Her mouth curved into the faintest smile. "Truth is a curious thing, Inspector. It changes its shape depending on who looks at it. My late husband used to say sermons are the art of making the guilty feel righteous. You'd have liked him." Miss Marple came forward quietly. "Yes, I dare say I would. He must have been a clever man. And yet clever men sometimes forget that cleverness doesn't soften cruelty." Mrs. Ledger turned her head, startled. "Cruelty?" she echoed. "Oh yes," Miss Marple said mildly, drawing closer. "Cruelty comes in many forms, you see. There's the kind that strikes and there's the kind that neglects. The vicar, I imagine, practiced the latter. I think he ruled this house as he ruled the parish, with kindness when it pleased him, and cold silence when it did not. Such a husband makes a woman very small inside, and one day she realizes she cannot bear it any longer." A long silence followed. Then Mrs. Ledger's shoulders dropped. "He called it guidance," she said quietly. "But yes, you're right. He kept me as he kept his accounts, balanced, orderly, without indulgence. And when the trust money disappeared, he told me it was none of my concern. He said the parish needed to learn humility, that no one would question a vicar. He was right, of course." Inspector Craven's voice was level. "So you poisoned him?" Her gaze didn't waver. "No, Inspector. I only prepared his tea. The rest was decided for me. The bottle was always there in the dark room, and I had thought of it often. But that night, when he spoke of Pierce discovering the withdrawals, I knew the parish would turn on him. And me. I couldn't bear the humiliation. I wanted him quiet, nothing more. I measured a single drop, too much, as it turned out," Miss Marple said gently, "and afterward, I prayed," Mrs. Ledger whispered, "and I told myself it was God's will. When the doctor called it a stroke, I said nothing. I told myself I'd been spared for repentance. And perhaps I was until Mr. Pierce began asking questions again." The words hung in the still air, heavy but oddly peaceful. Miss Marple folded her gloved hands together. "And so it began again," she said softly. "You saw history repeating itself. But this time you weren't the one to act. Someone else did, out of love or misguided loyalty." Craven's brow furrowed. "You mean Corbett?" "Yes," said Miss Marple. "He discovered her secret, likely by accident while working among the vicar's papers. He confronted her, perhaps out of pity, and when Pierce pressed too close, Corbett took it upon himself to save her reputation. Men do foolish things for the women they believe need protecting. He poisoned Pierce with the same chemical, perhaps unaware it would draw suspicion back to her." Mrs. Ledger's eyes glistened with something that was not quite tears. "He told me it was all right," she said faintly, "that he'd take the blame if it ever came to it. I didn't believe him until last night." Craven exhaled slowly. "And now he will hang for a crime you both share." She looked at him unflinching. "Then perhaps justice has found a balance after all. The vicar's sin was pride. Mine was cowardice, and Corbett's was devotion. You'll find the world is made up of those three." Miss Marple's voice was quiet but firm. "You may still make it right, Mrs. Ledger. A false confession does not wash away truth. You can still speak and perhaps spare him the gallows." Mrs. Ledger's gaze drifted toward the window, where sunlight was filtering through the lace curtains. "You think that will save me?" she asked softly. No, Miss Marple. The law may forgive, but the village won't. They'll say the vicar's wife killed twice over, the husband she served and the man who loved her. I've lived too long among judgment to face it again. Before either could stop her, she reached for the small glass vial on the table beside her, a familiar one, half full, the label nearly rubbed away. Craven lunged forward, but she was quick. The liquid touched her lips in a flash, and she gasped once, the sound thin and final. Her body went still within seconds. Dr. Haydock was sent for, but it was of no use. Miss Marple stood by the window, her face composed, her thoughts heavy. "It is the pattern I've seen before," she said softly as the inspector covered the lifeless form. "Sin begins with secrecy, and secrecy ends with silence. The poison was never in the bottle. It was in what they could not say aloud." Craven looked up at her, weary and shaken. "If you hadn't told me, she'd have gone free." Miss Marple shook her head gently. "No, Inspector. She was never free, not since the night her husband died. Some prisons are made of conscience, not bars." Outside, the bells of St. Mary Mead began to ring for the midday service. The sound floated through the open window, clear and haunting. Miss Marple turned her gaze toward the churchyard, where the grass stirred softly in the breeze. "Poor woman," she murmured. "She wanted peace and found it only the way she knew how. But at least now the vicarage is quiet again." Craven said nothing. He only removed his hat and bowed his head. When Miss Marple finally stepped out into the sunlight, she paused at the gate, looking back at the house. The curtains had been drawn, the door closed. The roses along the path nodded gently in the breeze, their petals falling like pale confessions onto the gravel. She took a deep breath, straightened her gloves, and walked home toward her garden, her mind already turning to the kettle she would boil, the knitting she would resume, and the quiet certainty that, for a while at least, St. Mary Mead would whisper of tragedy, and of the little old lady who had once again seen through to its heart. The village of St. Mary Mead woke the following morning to the kind of quiet that feels deliberate, as though the very hedgerows were keeping a confidence. News of Mrs. Ledger's death spread with the slow, solemn precision of something too dreadful to whisper, yet too irresistible to ignore. By 9 o'clock the grocer was speaking of the curse of the vicarage, and by 10 the postmistress had sworn that Miss Marple herself had predicted it all. Miss Marple, meanwhile, sat at her breakfast table, reading the newspaper without seeing it. The teapot steamed gently beside her, but her cup remained untouched. She had seen death before, more than most, and yet the quiet self-destruction of Mrs. Ledger left an ache that was curiously personal. At 10:30, a firm knock sounded on her door. It was Inspector Craven, looking as though he had not slept. He accepted her offer of tea with a tired nod, but did not drink. "Dr. Haydock signed the certificate at 8, he said. "Cyanide again. She must have hidden that vial before we arrived yesterday." Miss Marple inclined her head. "She meant to." Her calm was not recovery, Inspector. It was decision. Once she saw what must follow, she chose her own ending. You can't stop such things once they settle in the mind. Craven rubbed his temple. "I can't help feeling responsible. Corbett's been released, though he can hardly speak for the shock. He broke down when we told him. Kept saying she promised she wouldn't. He's leaving for London on the afternoon train." "I imagine he will," Miss Marple said softly. "St. Mary Mead is not kind to those who remind it of scandal. Still, I hope he writes again. Writers are like sinners. They improve with confession." Craven managed a faint smile, but then sighed. "There's one thing that still puzzles me. If she poisoned the vicar all those months ago, why keep the document hidden? Why not destroy it outright? That paper was the root of it all." Miss Marple looked down at her folded hands. "Because guilt rarely acts in straight lines. She kept it for the same reason she prayed over it, because it was both her burden and her proof of devotion. It tied her to him. Destroying it would have meant admitting she had been free all along." Craven nodded slowly, absorbing her words. "You make it sound almost inevitable. In a way it was. You see, Inspector, Mrs. Ledger wasn't evil, only tired of being small. When people feel powerless for too long, they begin to confuse mercy with release. The first time she told herself she'd spared her husband disgrace. The second, she thought she was protecting her memory. And both times she was wrong. The inspector rose after a few minutes, thanking her quietly. "I'll be taking the final statement to the coroner. There'll be an inquest, though I expect it will be brief. Would you care to attend?" "No," Miss Marple said gently. "The living should face that room. The dead have already done enough." When he left, she remained seated, staring at the untouched tea until it grew cold. Then, with the slow grace of age, she rose, fetched her shawl, and stepped out into the lane. The air smelled of lilac and wet earth, and the world, despite everything, looked very much the same. Children ran along the road chasing a hoop, and the church bell tolled a single measured note for the vicar's widow. She turned toward the churchyard, drawn not by morbid curiosity, but by the need to see for herself that endings could at least be tidy in appearance. The gravedigger was already at work near the Ledger plot, his shovel moving rhythmically. He paused when he saw her. "Mornin', Miss Marple," he said, touching his cap. Sad thing, that. She were a good lady, mostly. "Yes," Miss Marple replied, her eyes on the mound of freshly turned soil beside the vicar's stone. "Mostly." As she stood there, she noticed a movement by the hedge, a figure in a dark coat standing quite still. Giles Corbett. He did not approach, but when their eyes met, he gave a small nod of acknowledgement. He looked older, the arrogance of the city man gone. Miss Marple walked to him slowly. "I came to say goodbye," he said. His voice was quiet, stripped of its former self-assurance. "I couldn't leave without understanding if she suffered." "She suffered long before the end," Miss Marple said gently. "Her kind always do in silence. You saw it and mistook pity for love, perhaps. That is not a fault, Mr. Corbett, only a common tragedy." He gave a weary nod. "I suppose I did. I thought I could protect her, make amends somehow. But I only gave her another reason to hide. Protection," Miss Marple murmured, "is often only another form of possession. When we try to save someone from themselves, we forget they've already chosen their path." He looked down at the ground. "I'll sell the book I was writing. It was meant to be fiction, but it feels too close now. Too cruel. Then write something true," she advised. "About forgiveness, perhaps. It's a rarer subject." He smiled faintly. "I'll try." He hesitated, then added, "Thank you, Miss Marple. You saw what none of us could." She shook her head. "No, Mr. Corbett, I only listened. People tell you everything if you wait long enough." He left then, walking down the narrow path toward the gate, the sunlight catching the edge of his coat. Miss Marple watched until he vanished around the bend, then turned back to the graves. 2 names carved in the same stone now, and room for no more beneath it. That evening, St. Mary Mead returned to its customary peace. The shops closed early. The gossip turned to jam competitions and garden prizes. And the tragedy that had shaken the village began to settle into memory. From her sitting-room window, Miss Marple could see the faint glow of lamps in distant cottages and hear the hum of domestic comfort, the sound of life reclaiming its routine. She resumed her knitting, though the pattern had lost its urgency. Between stitches she reflected on how strange it was, this village life of hers, where the gravest sins hid behind lace curtains and good manners. One could never truly escape the mysteries of human nature. They bloomed even in the most respectable gardens. And yet, she thought, there was beauty in the resilience of it all. People sinned, suffered, repented, and then went on planting roses again. Outside, a night breeze stirred the curtains, carrying with it the faint scent of lilac from the churchyard. Miss Marple set down her knitting, folded her hands, and gazed into the quiet room. There was sadness, yes, but also understanding, which to her mind was the nearest thing to peace. "Poor Mrs. Ledger," she murmured. She wanted only to be seen, and in the end she was, by all the wrong eyes. The clock chimed 9. Miss Marple rose, turned off the lamp, and prepared for bed. Tomorrow, she knew, would bring another dawn, another set of small human dramas, and when they came she would be ready once more to observe, to listen, and if the occasion required, to see what others preferred not to see. In St. Mary Mead, evil was never loud, never gaudy. It came quietly, like the ticking of the clock on her mantle, persistent and ordinary, and that, Miss Marple reflected as she drew the curtains, was why it always returned. The next morning dawned golden and deceptively gentle. Sunlight pooled across the lanes of St. Mary Mead, gilding the hedges and brightening the windows, as if to insist that peace had returned. Yet for those who knew there was no such peace, only the hollow echo of tragedy that lingered in rooms where too much had been said too late. Miss Marple rose early, not from restlessness but because habit and conscience allowed her little sleep. She took her tea in the garden, where the roses opened as if unaware of human folly, and thought of Mrs. Ledger. It was curious, she reflected, how guilt could become a comfort, how some souls clung to it like a relic, even unto death. By 10, the inquest had been held at the village hall. The proceedings were swift, formal, and mercifully restrained. The coroner pronounced death by self-administered poison, while of unsound mind. No one mentioned the vicar's embezzlement, and the word murder was carefully avoided. Miss Marple attended quietly, her face composed, her gloved hands folded in her lap. When the verdict was read, a sigh of collective relief passed through the small audience. Relief not that justice had been done, but that the affair was finally over. Villagers dislike prolonged discomfort, especially moral ones. Afterward, outside the hall, the morning air was full of murmurs. Mrs. Price Ridley, with her usual piety sharpened by curiosity, said loudly that sin must always find its way to the surface. Miss Hartnell agreed, though she added that the vicar's sermons had always been rather too clever for her liking. Miss Marple made no comment. She only observed the faces around her. Grief in St. Mary Mead was seldom private. It was a social event with its own etiquette and gossip to follow. As the small crowd dispersed, Inspector Craven joined her on the church path. He looked tired but less grim than before. "It's done," he said quietly. The files closed. "Corbett's taken the noon train to London. Said he won't write again for a long time." "Perhaps not," Miss Marple replied. "But stories find their way through the cracks, Inspector. Even when their authors try to forget them." She smiled faintly. "I suspect one day he'll put it all into words, though under another name, of course." Craven gave a small, weary laugh. "You're probably right. And you'll go back to your roses, I suppose?" "I always do," she said. "They require patience and quiet, qualities useful for mending a world that doesn't learn easily." They parted amicably. Yet as Miss Marple walked home along the narrow lane, she felt the faint tug of something unresolved, some small imperfection in the pattern. Not a doubt of guilt, no, she was sure of that, but a whisper of sadness as though a corner of the truth had gone unspoken. She thought again of Mrs. Ledger's words. He called it guidance. How many women, she wondered, had lived under the weight of such guidance and mistaken it for affection? That afternoon she received a letter, hand-delivered by the postmistress. The handwriting was unfamiliar, neat but unpracticed. Inside was a single sheet of paper, unsigned. "You were right about mercy being a form of cowardice, but sometimes cowardice is all that remains when courage dies. Please destroy this. G.C." Miss Marple read it twice before setting it down beside her teacup. She did not destroy it. Instead, she placed it gently into her writing desk, between the pages of an old gardening almanac. Some truths she thought must be kept quietly, not erased. The following days passed as though the storm had never been. The parish committee resumed its meetings. The Women's Institute prepared for a charity bazaar. And by the end of the week, the tragedy at the vicarage had become something that was referred to only as that unfortunate business. The roses in Mrs. Ledger's garden were tended by a new tenant, a cheerful widow from Bath, who declared she would paint the study and make it a sunny place again. Miss Marple wished her well, but doubted that the house would ever be entirely sunny. Some places, she had long learned, keep shadows even in summer. One evening, a few weeks later, Miss Marple sat once more in her parlour as twilight crept over the village. The gramophone in the next cottage played a soft waltz, and the clock ticked with its usual contented rhythm. She was knitting something small, pale and delicate, when there came a knock at the door. It was Dr. Haydock. He entered, smiling wryly. "You know," he said, "for all your quiet ways, you cause more commotion in this village than any crime ever could." Miss Marple looked up with a sparkle in her eyes. "Oh, Doctor, it's not I who cause commotion. It's simply that human nature insists on behaving badly, and I insist on noticing." He chuckled. "Well, it's fortunate you do. Heaven help us if we had to rely solely on official procedure. Craven says you're wasted here." "I'm quite content," she replied. "The village provides all the drama I require. And one learns so much from small things, the way people pour tea, for instance, or the stories they tell to make themselves innocent." Haydock nodded, glancing at the folded newspaper on the table. "I sometimes wonder if we ever truly understand one another." "Rarely," she said softly, "but sometimes we catch glimpses, like seeing the truth reflected in a puddle. Imperfect, distorted, but enough to know what stands before us." He looked at her thoughtfully. "You have a way of finding peace in all this." "Peace," Miss Marple said, laying down her knitting, "isn't the absence of evil, Doctor. It's merely the acceptance that it exists and the resolve to tend one's garden regardless." After he left, she sat for a long time listening to the sounds of evening, the soft wind, the distant bark of a dog, the faint murmur of voices from the lane. Life was returning to its gentle rhythm as it always did. Yet beneath it ran that subtle awareness, the quiet understanding that murder and malice were not foreign to St. Mary Mead, but rather woven into its fabric, as naturally as gossip or Sunday service. When at last she rose to close the curtains, she caught sight of her reflection in the window, an elderly woman, delicate and unassuming, whose calm gaze belied the sharpness behind it. She smiled faintly at herself and whispered, "Well, Jane, the world keeps its secrets, but so do you." The lamplight glowed warm upon her face as she turned away. Outside, the village settled into silence, and above it the church bell struck 10, measured, patient, eternal. Miss Marple returned to her chair, lifted her knitting once more, and in the small, steady rhythm of her needles, found the solace that only truth, once seen clearly, could bring. Evening fell softly upon St. Mary Mead, the kind of tranquil dusk that seemed to wash away the memory of darker days. The vicarage stood quiet at last, its windows shuttered, the garden overgrown but peaceful. The house no longer belonged to whispers or secrets. It belonged only to time. Miss Marple, sitting in her parlour by the fire, watched the flames curl in their patient dance and reflected upon the curious pattern the whole affair had woven, a pattern of pride, guilt, and misplaced mercy, stitched together by the frailty of human conscience. The village, as villages do, had already moved on. Mrs. Price Ridley now spoke of the matter with that air of moral superiority reserved for those who have never been tempted, while Colonel Melchett declared it a bad business and promptly forgot it in favour of his dahlias. The church had held its memorial service, brief and proper, and the townsfolk had comforted themselves with the notion that evil, for the time being, had been exorcised. But Miss Marple knew better. Evil, in her experience, was not something to be cast out once and for all. It lingered, subtle as dust, in the corners of ordinary life. It existed in good people who chose silence, in small deceits that grew into calamities, in the human heart itself. She had not set out to judge Mrs. Ledger or Corbett, or even the late vicar. She had only followed the thread of truth where it led, and found at the end of it what she always found: loneliness. A light knock sounded at her door. When she opened it, she found Inspector Craven, his hat in his hands and an expression both apologetic and uncertain. "Forgive the intrusion?" "Miss Marple," he began, "but I was passing through and thought I might thank you properly. We've closed the matter for good this time. London's satisfied, and so am I." "Come in, Inspector," Miss Marple said, smiling faintly. "One shouldn't make formal gratitude in a doorway. The draught will catch you, and good manners deserve warmth." He stepped in, perching on the edge of her chair, as though afraid to disturb the neatness of her world. "It was a strange case," he said after a pause. "I've seen simpler murders, but never one that left me quite so unsettled. No villains, really, only weakness." Miss Marple poured him tea, steady and unhurried. "That's the trouble with human nature, Inspector. One rarely finds wickedness unaccompanied by self-justification. People commit dreadful acts and persuade themselves they are virtuous while doing them. Mrs. Ledger, for instance, believed she was preserving her husband's dignity. Mr. Corbett thought he was protecting her soul, and poor Mr. Pierce merely sought honesty. None of them intended wickedness, but wickedness came all the same." Craven nodded slowly. "I've the measure of it, as usual. Still, it feels sad somehow, empty." "Yes," she agreed softly. "Truth often does. We like to imagine justice as something clean, triumphant. But real justice is quiet. It simply restores the balance, nothing more. Life goes on, though a little wearier." For a while they sat in silence, listening to the clock tick and the fire crackle. Then Miss Marple leaned forward, her eyes thoughtful. "Tell me, Inspector, what will become of the vicarage?" He hesitated. "It'll be sold, I expect. The diocese will see to it. Some family from the city, perhaps. A new start. That's as it should be," she said, nodding. "A house can't live on sorrow forever. Though I hope whoever comes has the sense to open the windows. Air and sunlight cure what confession cannot." Craven smiled faintly. "You think the house itself is guilty?" "Oh, heavens, no. But places remember. A careless word, a secret kept too long, those things leave impressions. Still, even ghosts fade, given time." He finished his tea and stood. "You make murder sound almost domestic, Miss Marple." Her eyes twinkled. "Murder is domestic, Inspector. It happens not in dark alleys, but in parlours, kitchens and gardens, among people who know each other far too well. The world may change its methods, but the motives remain very old indeed." He thanked her once more and took his leave, his heavy boots fading down the lane. Miss Marple watched from the window as the last light faded from the sky, her thoughts calm but not idle. She had seen the worst and best of humanity tangled together, and knew they would never truly be separated. Later she took out her knitting, the needles glinting in the lamplight. The simple rhythm soothed her. Each stitch, neat and precise, reminded her that order could be restored, if not in the world, then at least in one's own small corner of it. As she worked, her mind wandered to Mrs. Ledger's final expression, not of fear, but of release. There was tragedy in that, yes, but also understanding. Perhaps in her final act, the poor woman had found the courage she'd always lacked, the courage to face herself. Miss Marple murmured a quiet prayer for her, and for all those who hid behind duty until it turned to deceit. When the fire burned low, she rose to draw the curtains. Outside, the moon lay over St. Mary Mead like pale silk. The village was asleep, and the church bell marked the hour with steady grace. Tomorrow, she thought, there would be new gossip, new trivialities, new life. The world never stopped for grief. It merely folded it neatly into its fabric. She paused at the window, her reflection blending with the garden beyond. An elderly lady in repose, surrounded by roses and order. Yet beneath that surface, a mind forever alive with the knowledge of human frailty. "Well," she said softly to herself, "that's another little tragedy put to rest. Until the next." Then she smiled, not unkindly, and returned to her chair where the last of the firelight touched her silver hair. The needles clicked gently once more, the sound as steady and comforting as the heart of the village itself. And so, with calm dignity, Miss Marple's world settled back into its rhythm, proof that even after death and deceit and the unravelling of secrets, life in St. Mary Mead would always go quietly on.